Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to another whispered true crime story, shared softly to calm your mind while revealing the hidden dangers of real life. These are not just stories to pass the time, they are true events, and each one carries a lesson. I don't want you to only listen, I want you to learn, so you never fall into the same traps, so you never become the next victim. Share this with your family and friends because protecting them may start with something as simple as this story. And I know many of you use these whispers to fall asleep. But before you drift away, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. It may feel small, but it's the only way this channel survives, and the only reason I can keep whispering these true cases night after night. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel across the world, so don't put it off until tomorrow. Do it now, before sleep takes you away. Now relax, slow your breathing, and let's begin tonight's case. Story 1. On a cold Friday afternoon in February 1993, shoppers filled the Strand shopping center in Bootle, just outside Liverpool. It was an ordinary day, noisy with footsteps echoing across tiled floors, tills ringing, and parents tugging their children along by the hand. Nobody there could have imagined that history was about to be made in the most disturbing way, through the quiet disappearance of a 2-year-old boy whose name would soon echo through every street, every living room, and every newspaper in the country. The boy was James Bulger. He had blue eyes, a wide, bright smile, and the playful innocence of a child who was only days away from his 3rd birthday. That afternoon, his mother had taken him shopping. To everyone passing by, they looked like any mother and son enjoying a normal outing. But within minutes, something happened that would shatter lives, ignite outrage across the world, and leave a permanent scar on Britain's conscience. 2 children, only 10 years old, were moving through the same shopping center. They weren't there for groceries. They weren't there with their parents. They had skipped school, wandering the halls like they had done many times before, stealing small items, looking for trouble. On that particular day, they weren't just mischievous boys. They were searching for something, watching, waiting. No one noticed the way they lingered at the entrance of shops. No one saw the way their eyes followed the smaller children, measuring them, testing chances. They were not men. They were not strangers in dark coats. They were just children themselves. Yet in their young minds, something unspeakable was forming. As James's mother reached for her purse inside the butcher's shop, her little boy stood at the doorway, just a step away, waiting patiently for her to finish. It was the kind of everyday moment that any parent knows. The few seconds where a child stands close, trusting, while the parent sorts out a simple task. Those few seconds were all it took. When his mother turned back, James was gone. At first, it was confusion, then panic, then dread. She searched, calling his name, scanning the crowded center, rushing back and forth. Security was alerted. Announcements rang out, and shoppers glanced around. Yet James was nowhere to be seen. What nobody realized in that moment was that James hadn't wandered off. He hadn't strayed to look at a toy or followed a sound. He had been taken, led away by 2 other children. 2 10-year-old boys, holding his small hand, guiding him out of the shopping center and into the beginning of one of the darkest crimes Britain had ever witnessed. Liverpool in the early 1990s was a city carrying the weight of hardship. Families struggled with unemployment, poverty, and fractured homes. Streets in many neighborhoods were filled with children roaming freely, some looking for escape from chaotic households, others simply following the crowd. Robert Thompson was one of those children. Born on August 23, 1982, he was the 5th of 7 brothers. His childhood home was marked by absence and turmoil. His father had walked away, leaving his mother to raise all of 7 children on her own. The burden was too heavy. His mother sank into depression, and when she could no longer cope, she turned to alcohol. There were moments of despair so deep that she even tried to take her own life. Inside that crowded house, life was not calm. Robert often faced violence, not from strangers, but from his own siblings. The older boys singled him out, mocked him for sucking his thumb, and beat him for it. What he used as comfort, they used as a weapon against him. As Robert grew, he spent less time inside and more time on the streets. By the age of 8, he was already slipping into petty crime. He was caught stealing, and people began to describe him as streetwise beyond his years. Some called him an urban pebble-dash child, a boy hardened too early, shaped by chaos. Despite this, before the crime that would later define him, Robert was not known for violence in school. Teachers did not record him as dangerous, yet detectives who interviewed him years later would say that he carried himself like someone far older, a child who had seen too much too soon. John Venables was also a Liverpool boy, born just 10 days before Robert on August 13, 1982. Like Robert, he grew up in a broken home. His parents separated, but unlike Robert's absent father, John's father remained in his life. John split his time between his mother's house and his father's, spending part of the week with each. His mother, however, was harsh. In the neighborhood, she had a reputation. Some said she was promiscuous, though how much of that was truth and how much was gossip is unclear. What was clear was the way she treated her son. John feared her, and at home he felt little safety. At school, his behavior worried teachers. He rocked back and forth in his seat, banged his head on desks, and howled like an animal. He was restless, unable to sit still, hyperactive. Sometimes he would even hurt other children, lashing out in ways that alarmed those around him. Once he tried to strangle a fellow pupil. Still, behind these behaviors were signs of struggle. Rocking, banging, and strange habits are often ways children try to calm themselves when their emotions overwhelm them. Yet instead of help, John was often met with frustration from teachers and punishment for being disruptive. When Robert and John first met, they weren't friends. Robert teased John, picking on him the way others had picked on him at home. But eventually, both boys were held back a year at school. Sharing the same class drew them closer. What began as conflict turned into a friendship. Together they skipped lessons. They wandered the streets instead of sitting in classrooms. They broke into shops, stole toys and sweets, and built reputations as troublemakers. They scared old women for fun, jumping out at them in the street. To the boys, it was just mischief. To their victims, it was cruelty. By the time February 1993 arrived, both Robert Thompson and John Venables were 10 years old. Their lives had already veered far from the paths of most children their age. That February afternoon, they left school again, not for lessons, but for something else. On Friday, February 12, 1993, Robert Thompson and John Venables did not go to school. They left instead for the Strand Shopping Center in Bootle. It was not the first time they had skipped lessons. That day, they moved through the center together, stealing small items from different shops. They took sweets. They stole a troll doll. They picked up a tin of blue modeling paint. Each item slipped into their hands with ease, as though it was routine for them. To anyone watching, they looked like ordinary children wandering through the crowds, but the pair carried something darker in mind. At one point, they targeted a little girl and her younger brother outside a shop. The girl was 3, the boy was 2. They managed to lure the children a short distance away. For a moment, it looked as though they had succeeded, but the children's mother quickly noticed. She rushed after them, pulled her children back, and the chance was gone. Robert and John walked on. They did not stop. They watched. They waited. At the same time, inside a butcher shop on the lower floor of the center, Denise Bulger was paying for meat. Beside her was her son James. He was 2 years old, with his third birthday only days away. He stood at the doorway of the shop, just a few feet away, waiting for his mother to finish. Denise took out her purse. She let go of James's hand for only a few seconds while she paid. Those seconds were enough. Robert Thompson and John Venables were close by. They saw James standing alone. They moved quickly. John reached for the toddler's hand, and the two boys led him away. CCTV cameras captured the moment. John held James's hand. Robert walked a few steps ahead, and together they left the shopping center. It was 3:42 p.m. Denise turned back and saw that James was no longer in the doorway. She called for him. She ran from the shop, searching the aisles and corridors. Within moments, she alerted security. Announcements went out across the center. Shoppers glanced around. Some looked down to see if a small boy was wandering nearby. But James was not there. In less than 2 minutes, he had been taken out of the Strand by two 10-year-old boys. Robert Thompson and John Venables led James Bulger out of the Strand shopping center. John still held the toddler's small hand. Robert walked just a little ahead. Outside, the three of them moved into the busy streets. James cried for his mother. His voice carried, but the two boys pulled him along. They headed toward the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. When they reached the edge, the boys encouraged James to kneel and look into the water. He refused. He pulled back. Anger rose in them. Robert picked him up and threw him to the ground. James struck his head. A bruise and a cut opened across his forehead. People nearby noticed. Witnesses later recalled the sight of a small boy, upset, being pulled along by two older children. Some saw the bruise. Some saw him crying. Some watched as the boys kicked and pushed him. Yet none intervened. At one point, the noise of James crying made Robert and John run. They feared they might be stopped, but when they looked back, they turned again and called James to follow. Injured and frightened, he obeyed. Along the route, nearly 40 people saw them. Some thought James was their younger brother. Others assumed the two boys were taking him to a police station. One woman even gave them directions to the nearest station after they told her he was lost. In truth, they did not take him there. Instead, they continued walking, pulling James through the streets, across roads, past shops, and into neighborhoods. The journey stretched for more than 2 miles. James stumbled. He cried. He tried to dig his heels into the ground. But each time he resisted, Robert and John dragged him forward, striking him when he slowed. By now, the sky had grown darker. Evening was setting in. Still, the two boys led James onward, away from the center, away from safety, toward the railway line. As Robert Thompson and John Venables dragged James Bulger along the streets, people noticed. They saw a toddler in distress, his forehead marked with a fresh bruise, his small body crying out for help. One woman stopped them. She asked what was happening. The boys told her that James was lost, and they were taking him to the police station. She gave them directions. She even watched as they walked away, but she noticed they did not head toward the station. She let them go on. Another woman, this time with her own daughter, saw James struggling. She bent down and asked him if he was all right. James did not answer. The bruise on his face was clear. For a moment, her own child held James's hand. Robert and John quickly stepped in, saying again that he was lost and they were helping him. The woman hesitated. She thought something was wrong. She wanted to take James herself to the station, But when she asked another passerby to watch her daughter so she could do so, the woman refused. She said her dog didn't like children, so the mother let James go, and the boys pulled him away once more. Others saw the same thing: James being pushed, James being kicked, James being dragged along the road while crying for his mother. Some saw him lifted high and carried roughly, his legs swinging in the air. Some noticed the bump on his forehead, but each time, Robert and John brushed it off. They told whoever asked that James was their little brother, or that they had been told to take him home. Witnesses stepped aside. The three of them continued to walk. At one point, they stopped outside a shop. James stood with them, still upset. The owner of a nearby pet shop noticed the way the older boys held him. It looked wrong. The grip was too tight, too harsh. Still, no one acted. 2 miles passed under their feet. James, only 2 years old, stumbled again and again, but the two boys kept dragging him on. Each witness who saw them had a chance to stop it. None did. Ahead of them was the railway line. By the time Robert Thompson and John Venables reached the railway line, James Bulger had been dragged more than 2 miles from the shopping center. His forehead was bruised, his face stained with tears, and his cries for his mother had echoed through the streets. At the embankment near the tracks, the two boys led him down toward the ground. They had brought with them the tin of blue modeling paint they had stolen earlier. John took the tin and splashed the thick paint over James's face. Drops ran across his skin and into his eye. James screamed in pain. The assault did not stop there. Stones were forced into his mouth. He was thrown to the ground and kicked. They stamped on him, they struck him, they hit him with bricks. The blows left marks and bruises across his small body. They pulled at his clothes. His shoes were removed. His trousers and underpants were taken off. Injuries suggested a sexual assault had taken place, though neither boy ever admitted it. Then came the final act. They picked up a heavy iron bar from the railway yard, a 20-inch long fish plate weighing more than 20 pounds. They raised it and brought it down on James's head. The force shattered his skull, leaving 10 separate fractures. When it was over, they dragged his small body onto the tracks. They placed bricks and rubble across his head and chest to hold him in place. They wanted it to look like an accident. Then they walked away. Darkness fell, and a train passed along the line. James's body was struck and cut in two. 2 days later, on February 14th, 1993, James Bulger's body was found. A group of teenagers were playing near the railway line in Walton, Liverpool. At first, they thought they saw a broken doll lying by the tracks, but as they came closer, they realized it was not a toy. It was the body of a small child. They ran in shock to the nearest police station. Officers were dispatched to the scene. What they found horrified them. James's body lay on the railway line. His lower half had been carried further down the track by the passing train. His upper half remained where the boys had left him. His clothes from the waist down had been removed and placed nearby. His underwear and trousers were blood-stained and discarded. His shoes were gone. Around his body were signs of the attack. Blood-stained bricks were scattered close by. Stones were marked with red. A heavy iron bar, the railway fish plate, was found. It carried the evidence of the blows that had shattered his skull. 3 batteries were also found near his body. The blue modeling paint they had thrown into his face was recovered at the scene too. The injuries to James were severe. The pathologist later counted 42 separate injuries. 22 were to his head and face. 20 more covered his body. The blows had fractured his skull in multiple places. His cheek was bruised, his ear was damaged, his jaw had broken across. The right side of his head was shattered. The damage to his brain was massive. There were marks on his face that matched the shape of a shoe. His lip was cut. His mouth was bruised. Fragments from the bricks that had been used to strike him were found inside his clothes and scarf. The pathologist later concluded that James had still been alive when Robert Thompson and John Venables left him on the tracks. He may have survived for a short time after the assault before the train struck his body. News of the discovery spread quickly. Flowers were laid near the tracks by locals who were shaken by what had happened. The country learned that a toddler had been murdered. After James Bulger's body was discovered, detectives began their work. They searched the scene carefully, collecting every item left behind. The bricks were bagged. The heavy iron bar was taken as evidence. The batteries were noted. The blue modeling paint was secured. Each piece would later help them understand what had happened to the child. Attention turned to the shopping center. Officers studied the CCTV footage from the Strand. The images showed James walking with two boys. The grainy black and white pictures were not sharp, but it was clear. The child was holding the hand of another child, while a second walked slightly ahead. At first, detectives thought the abductors must have been older, perhaps teenagers, maybe young men. Few believed that children as young as 10 could be responsible for what had been done. Still, the images were released. The photographs of James being led away were broadcast across the nation. Newspapers printed them. Television showed them again and again. The appeal was direct. Who were these boys? Someone must know them. Inside Liverpool, the photographs were recognized. People came forward. Teachers saw the images. Locals who knew the children saw them too. Names were given. The descriptions matched Robert Thompson and John Venables. Police moved quickly. On February 18, 1993, 6 days after James had been taken, the two boys were arrested. On February 18, 1993, police arrived to take Robert Thompson and John Venables into custody. They were both 10 years old. When questioned, Robert asked the officers if James had been taken to hospital so they could get him alive again. The remark was noted down. Investigators examined the boys' clothes. Forensics tested them. On Robert Thompson's right shoe, they found blood. The DNA matched James Bulger. Experts later said the chances of an error were 1 in a billion. Blood was also discovered on John Venables' clothing. Paint found on James's body was matched to the stolen blue modeling paint. Fibers from James's clothes were found on the boys. One of John's shoes was missing its front section, consistent with a kick strong enough to leave marks on James's face. The evidence tied them to the murder. Both boys were charged with James Bulger's abduction and murder, as well as the attempted abduction of another child earlier that day. They were remanded in custody while they waited for trial. During police interviews, the boys were questioned for more than 20 hours. They were separated and asked repeatedly about what had happened. At first, Robert denied everything. He said they had been at the Strand but had left early. He claimed they had gone to the library. Later, he admitted being with James, but he blamed John. He said John had killed him, hitting him with bricks and the iron bar. Robert said he had tried to stop John, pulling him away, but could not. John also denied involvement at first. He said he had not even been at the Strand. When told that Robert had named him, John became hysterical. He called Robert a liar. Eventually, after speaking with his mother, John admitted his part. He said Robert had led James away, but he too had attacked him. He admitted throwing bricks and stones, but again tried to push the greater blame onto Robert. Both boys accused each other. Neither accepted full responsibility. After their arrests, Robert Thompson and John Venables were charged with the abduction and murder of James Bulger, as well as the attempted abduction of another child on the same day. Both boys pleaded not guilty. Because they were so young, at first they were referred to only as Child A and Child B. Their names were not released. Authorities debated whether their identities should remain secret or whether the public had the right to know. The boys were interviewed over many hours. In those interviews, they gave different accounts. Each blamed the other. Robert spoke calmly, showing little emotion. John broke down often, crying and becoming distressed. Detectives described them as a match made in hell. The case drew enormous attention. The crime shocked the nation, and outside the court, large crowds gathered. Some shouted for the boys to be hanged. Many wanted revenge. The atmosphere was tense. The trial was set for November 1993, to be held in Preston. By then, the boys were 11 years old. They would be the youngest children in modern British history to be tried for murder in an adult court. In preparation, special arrangements were made. The boys could not sit with their parents. They sat in the dock, raised up on chairs so they could see over the barrier. Guards stood nearby. Social workers were also present. The law at the time required prosecutors to prove not only that the boys had committed the acts, but also that they knew their actions were seriously wrong. Under the principle of doli incapax, children under the age of 14 were presumed incapable of crime unless it could be shown that they understood the gravity of what they did. For the prosecution, that meant they had to demonstrate more than just involvement. They had to prove Robert and John knew their acts were wicked. The trial began on November 1st, 1993. On November 1st, 1993, the trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables began at Preston Crown Court. The boys were small in the dock. They sat on raised chairs so they could see over the wooden barrier. Guards stood close. Social workers stayed by their side. Their parents were present, but not allowed to sit with them. The prosecution laid out its case. They said Robert and John had not simply wandered with James, but had deliberately abducted him. They described the way the boys had stolen the paint and how it had been thrown into James's face. They detailed the batteries found near his body. They told the jury how the bricks and iron bar had been used to inflict fatal injuries. Witness after witness entered the court, 38 in total. They gave evidence of what they had seen on the streets that day. They spoke of a small boy, crying, being dragged, being hit. Some described him resisting, digging his heels into the ground. Others recalled the bruise on his forehead. The CCTV footage from the shopping center was shown. It captured the moment James was led away. In one frame, John held James's hand. Robert walked ahead. The images were silent, but the sight was clear. Forensic experts gave their findings. They explained how blood found on Robert's shoe matched James's DNA. They showed how the modeling paint linked directly to the tin stolen from the Strand. They presented fibers from James's clothing recovered from the boys' clothes. Shoe marks found on James's body matched footwear worn by the boys. The jury listened as the pathologist described James's injuries: 42 wounds, 10 skull fractures, the conclusion that he had still been alive when left on the tracks. The defense argued that the boys were too young to fully understand the weight of their actions. They said Robert had been more dominant, while John had been led along. They pointed to the law of doli incapax, but the evidence was heavy. Neither Robert nor John gave evidence themselves. Psychologists advised they would not be able to understand or cope with cross-examination. Instead, their taped police interviews were played in court. The jury heard their voices, Robert's steady tone, John's breakdowns and crying, each blaming the other. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables lasted 3 weeks. On November 24th, 1993, the jury reached its decision. 9 men and 3 women sat together and delivered the verdict. Robert Thompson and John Venables were both found guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger. The judge, Mr. Justice Moreland, addressed the court. He called the crime an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. He ordered that the boys be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. This was the equivalent of a life sentence for children. At first, the judge recommended a minimum term of 8 years. Soon after, the Lord Chief Justice raised it to 10. Then, the Home Secretary, Michael Howard, increased the sentence to 15 years. James Bulger's parents fought for more. They gathered petitions. More than 270,000 people signed, asking for the sentence to be longer. The weight of the signatures showed the anger across the country. But in 1999, the European Court of Human Rights intervened. It ruled that the trial had not been fair for children so young. It also decided that the Home Secretary should not set the tariff. The minimum sentence was reduced back to 8 years. Outside the court, crowds gathered during the trial and after the verdict. Some shouted for death sentences. Others held banners. The reaction was strong, louder than in almost any other case before. Robert Thompson and John Venables were led away. Both were just 11 years old. After the verdict, Robert Thompson and John Venables were sent into secure custody. Both were detained at Her Majesty's pleasure with no fixed release date. Robert was placed at Barton Moss Secure Care Center in Manchester. The unit was not like a prison. It was a secure home, heavily staffed, where children had access to therapy, education, and structured routines. Staff described the environment as ordered and safe, with more adults per child than in most institutions. While there, Robert's mother visited him every 3 days. Over time, Robert settled into the regime. He studied. He showed ability in art. He passed 5 GCSEs and went on to take A-levels. His progress was noted. John was sent to a secure unit in St. Helens on Merseyside. His parents visited him regularly. John's time there was different. He struggled with nightmares and flashbacks. He often told staff that he could smell James on his clothes. Sometimes before court hearings, he changed outfits several times, telling his parents he still felt the baby's scent. During the trial itself, John had asked his parents if James was in the courtroom. Later, in the secure unit, he told staff he sometimes believed James was growing inside him. Professionals thought it was a psychological way of trying to repair what had happened. While Robert improved with structure and education, John showed deeper troubles. Both remained in custody through their teenage years. They turned 18 while still held inside. Robert Thompson and John Venables turned 18 while still held in secure custody. When their time came, both were released on lifelong license. This meant they would live in the community under strict conditions. If they broke the rules, they would be sent back to prison. Before release, both were given new identities. An injunction was granted, making it illegal to publish their real names or current locations. The court order was worldwide, preventing newspapers or individuals from exposing who they had become. This was to protect them from harm, as public anger toward them remained fierce. Robert Thompson left custody with a record of progress. He had completed his studies. He had shown talent in art. Reports described him as someone who had adjusted to the structured environment and made use of the opportunities given. In 2006, reports surfaced that Robert was living in the northwest of England. He was said to be in a stable relationship with another man. Nothing further was revealed, as his new life remained hidden by the injunction. John Venables' release was different. Soon after leaving secure custody, he began to struggle. By the time he was 17, while still in detention, it was alleged that he had sexual contact with a female staff member. When free, he suffered from depression. He began drinking heavily and using drugs. In 2008, John was arrested twice. First for a public order offense after a fight outside a nightclub, later for possession of a small amount of cocaine. His behavior broke the strict terms of his license. Worse came after. He was discovered with child abuse images. Police found him trying to destroy his computer hard drive when they arrived. On it were images of children, including material showing very young children being harmed. He admitted to downloading and distributing them. He had also been visiting chat rooms, posing as a woman and talking with a convicted pedophile. He claimed to be a mother abusing her own daughter. John Venables was returned to prison. He received a 2-year sentence for the child abuse offenses. Authorities said they had been shocked, though the evidence of his struggles had been clear for years. After John Venables was returned to prison for child abuse offenses, more details about his life outside came to light. Authorities discovered that he had been breaking license conditions even before the images were found. He had been visiting places he was not allowed to go, including Merseyside. He had also been forming relationships with underage girls while in his 20s. Some reports suggested that he dated teenage girls regularly, claiming he was going through a delayed adolescence. Others saw it differently, pointing to his unhealthy interest in younger people. While John was back in custody, the Justice Secretary ordered a review. Sir David Omand was asked to look into how Venables had been managed after his release in 2001. The review concluded that nothing in his record at the time had shown he was a danger. James Bulger's parents disagreed. They called the review a whitewash. Venables served 2 years for the child abuse images, but his problems did not end. In 2017, he was caught again. This time, police found more than 1,000 child abuse images on his computer. He also possessed a manual that gave instructions on how to sexually abuse young girls. He admitted the charges. In 2018, he was sentenced to 40 months in prison. The judge who sentenced him ruled that his anonymity would remain protected. The injunction stayed in place as authorities believed his life would be in danger if his identity were revealed. The cost of protecting Venables was high. Reports suggested that the government had considered relocating him abroad because of the constant risk of his identity being exposed and the anger that still surrounded his name. While Venables continued to offend and returned to prison, Robert Thompson remained out of sight. Reports described him as living quietly, keeping to himself, and not drawing attention. The difference between their two lives grew clearer with each passing year. As the years passed, questions continued about why Robert Thompson and John Venables had killed James Bulger. One theory suggested jealousy. James had been a child who was deeply loved, a boy adored by his parents. John, at home, had siblings with special educational needs. Some believed he felt overshadowed by the attention they received. Others said Robert, too, may have been jealous after the birth of a younger sibling who became the focus of his mother's care. Some pointed out that James looked similar to one of John's siblings, which led to suggestions that he had been singled out for that reason. But this theory had gaps. Before taking James, the boys had tried to abduct other children at the shopping center. They had approached a little girl and her brother and only failed because their mother noticed in time. It showed that their choice of James was not specific. They had been looking for any child. Another line of thought came from the evidence of what they did at the railway line. The assault had included pulling off James's trousers and underwear. Pathologists believed there were signs of a sexual element to the attack. John and Robert never admitted this. When questioned about it, John became hysterical. Robert grew angry, but experts said the injuries were consistent with sexual assault. This led to speculation that John might have been abused himself. His later offenses with child abuse images seemed to support the idea. Still, nothing was proven. What was clear was that the act had not been random mischief. It was deliberate. They had tried to take another child before James. They had lied to witnesses. They had tricked adults by claiming James was their brother or a lost boy they were taking to the police. And in the end, they had inflicted a level of violence that investigators said went beyond what they had ever seen. The case left open questions, but no firm answers. For James Bulger's parents, the loss never faded. His mother, Denise, spoke often about him. She described how James had been a happy child with bright blue eyes and a wide smile. She remembered his love for Thomas the Tank Engine, his trampoline, and the simple joy of sweets from the shop. When James was taken, she was only in the butcher's shop for a moment. She had let go of his hand to pay, just for seconds. In that gap, Robert and John led him away. For Denise, that moment replayed over and over. She said she felt she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The family had already known pain. Before James, Denise and her husband had lost a daughter who was stillborn. James had been their only living child. To lose him in such a brutal way cut even deeper. After his death, Denise and her husband continued their lives but never escaped the shadow. Denise later remarried and had 3 more children, including one she was pregnant with at the time James was taken. She said those children brought her strength, but she always kept James present. At Christmas, she set a place for him at the table. James's father also built a new life, marrying again and having children of his own. Yet both parents carried the wound. They sat through the trial, listening to every detail of what had been done to their son. They heard witnesses describe him crying for his mother. They heard the pathologist list every injury. They knew he had asked for them before he died. The pain was permanent. It was a life sentence of its own. When Robert Thompson and John Venables were tried, the law in England still carried the principle of doli in capax. This meant children under 10 were seen as incapable of committing a crime. At the time, it extended up to the age of 14 unless it was proven that the child knew their act was seriously wrong. In the case of Robert and John, the prosecution had to show they understood. Evidence of lying to witnesses, hiding what they had done, and trying to stage James's death as an accident convinced the court that they did know. The jury accepted it. After the trial, arguments began over whether the age of criminal responsibility was set too low. Some pointed to other countries in Europe. In Sweden, the age was 15. England's age of 10 was the youngest across Europe. The debate grew louder after the European Court of Human Rights ruled in 1999 that the trial had been unfair. The judges said the courtroom setting was too formal and intimidating for children so young. They also said the Home Secretary should not have power to set sentences for minors. In 1998, the government changed the law. The presumption of doli in capax was removed for children over 10. From then on, a child of 10 could be held fully responsible for a crime without the prosecution needing to prove they understood it was wrong. The James Bulger case stood at the center of these changes. It shaped how the justice system handled young offenders from then onward. Robert Thompson's time in custody was closely watched. He had been sent to Barton Moss Secure Center, and over the years, staff recorded his progress. He was given education. He attended classes every day. He developed an interest in art, showing talent in drawing and painting. His teachers encouraged him, and he built confidence. Robert also took exams. He achieved 5 GCSE passes. Later, he went on to study for A-levels. Staff saw him as someone who had used the opportunities inside the secure unit to better himself. Reports written about Robert described how he settled into the routine. He followed instructions, and he showed improvement in behavior compared to when he first arrived. His mother continued to visit him regularly, every 3 days. She remained a constant presence. When Robert turned 18, he was still in secure custody. He continued with his studies. The environment gave him more support than he had ever had at home before the crime. Workers said he adjusted well to it. This progress became part of the decision-making when his release was considered later. John Venables was held in a secure unit in St. Helens on Merseyside. His parents visited him often, staying in contact while he served his sentence. Inside, John struggled in ways that were very different from Robert. Staff noticed that he was deeply unsettled. He had nightmares. He told them he suffered from flashbacks. He often said he could smell James on his clothes. Because of this, he changed his outfits before court hearings, sometimes more than once, saying he could not get rid of the scent. During the trial, John had asked his parents if James was in the courtroom. After the conviction in the secure unit, he told staff he sometimes believed James was growing inside him. Professionals believed this was a way his mind tried to make sense of what had happened. Over the years, his behavior showed how much he was struggling. He was different from Robert, who had been adjusting well to structure and education. John seemed trapped in a cycle of guilt, confusion, and disturbed thoughts. Staff continued to monitor him closely, but his difficulties never left. When Robert Thompson and John Venables turned 18, both were released from secure custody. Their release came under strict lifelong license. This meant they could live outside, but if they broke any rules, they would be returned to prison. Before release, both were given new identities. A worldwide injunction was granted, making it illegal for anyone to publish their real names or locations. This order was designed to protect them from revenge attacks because anger toward them was still strong across the country. Robert's release followed years of progress inside. He had studied, achieved his GCSEs, and even taken A-levels. Reports said he had adjusted to the environment and used it to change his behavior. After leaving custody, Robert disappeared from public view. In 2006, reports surfaced that he was living in the northwest of England. He was described as being in a stable gay relationship. Beyond that, nothing more was revealed. His new identity was protected, and his life stayed hidden. John Venables' release was more troubled. Even before he left secure custody fully, when he was 17, there were allegations that he had a sexual relationship with a female staff member. After release, he began to suffer from depression. He turned to alcohol and drugs. In 2008, he was arrested twice. Once was for a fight outside a nightclub. Another time was for possession of a small amount of cocaine. These offenses broke the strict terms of his license. But worse would follow later. After John Venables had been arrested for fighting and for cocaine possession, his situation worsened. Police discovered that he was hiding something far more serious. When they came to his home, they found him trying to destroy his computer hard drive. That alone raised suspicion. Officers quickly learned why he had been so desperate. On the device, they uncovered child abuse images. He had not only downloaded them, but also distributed them. The material showed very young children, some as young as 2, being harmed. Investigators also found that Venables had been visiting chat rooms. In these conversations, he pretended to be a woman. He told a convicted pedophile that he was a mother who abused her own daughter. The discoveries were enough to bring him back into custody. He was charged with the offenses. In court, he admitted what he had done. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Authorities said they had been shocked by what he had done. At the same time, his actions showed that his life outside custody was spiraling out of control. The contrast between him and Robert Thompson grew wider. While Robert stayed hidden and quiet, John was once again behind bars. After John Venables was caught with the images and returned to prison, the Justice Secretary ordered a full review. Sir David Omand was chosen to lead it. He was asked to investigate how Venables had been managed after his release in 2001. The review examined his years outside. It looked at his license conditions, his arrests for fighting and cocaine, and finally the offenses involving child abuse images. The conclusion of the review was clear. It said there had been nothing in Venables' record at the time of his release that showed he was a danger. The report placed the blame squarely on him for what followed. James Bulger's parents strongly disagreed. They called the review a whitewash. For them, the idea that no risks had been seen in Venables was impossible to accept. They argued that he had never been ready to be released. Despite the protests, the official findings stood. The responsibility for the offenses was pinned on Venables alone. In 2017, John Venables was once more found offending. This time, officers discovered that he had been in possession of over 1,000 child abuse images. When they searched his computer, they also found a manual. It was a step-by-step guide on how to abuse young girls. The material showed that his interest had not stopped after his earlier conviction. He admitted the offenses. In 2018, he appeared in court. The judge said the content was disturbing and dangerous. Venables was sentenced to 40 months in prison. By now, his protection had already cost the public large sums of money. Because of his repeated offending, his new identity had been compromised more than once. Authorities had to move him and protect him at different times to keep him safe. Still, the court granted that he would keep his anonymity. Judges ruled that if his identity was revealed, he would face serious violence. The order protecting him stayed in place. Even with this, discussion began about whether he could ever be managed safely in the United Kingdom. Officials raised the idea of moving him abroad, where protection might cost less and where he could start again under another identity. By 2019, John Venables was again being considered for parole. He had served part of his 40-month sentence for possessing the new collection of child abuse images and the abuse manual. Officials reviewed his case. They discussed whether he could be freed again into society. At the same time, there was fear about what might happen if he was released. His history of reoffending weighed heavily. Authorities also knew that his protection was expensive. Every time his identity was revealed or suspected, they had to relocate him. Security around him had cost the taxpayer millions. The idea of moving him abroad was raised more seriously. If he were placed in another country under a new name, it might reduce the cost and lower the chance of recognition. But the danger of releasing him at all still remained. His parole hearings kept James Bulger's family in the spotlight again. Each time they faced the possibility that Venables might walk free despite his record. The case, decades after James's murder, was still unresolved in the public mind. The question of whether Venables should ever live outside prison again continued to divide opinion. The long years since the murder of James Bulger left questions that were never settled. Some believed that Robert Thompson had managed to rebuild his life. Reports said he was still living quietly in a stable relationship, protected by the court order that hid his identity. He had not come back to the attention of police. John Venables was different. His repeated arrests for child abuse images, his disturbing online behavior, and the manual found in his possession had made his future uncertain. Each parole hearing brought anger and fear, especially for James's parents. They believed he should never be released again. The idea of moving him abroad showed how serious his case had become. Officials worried not just about the cost of protecting him, but also about the safety of the public if he was freed once more. The murder itself remained one of the most shocking crimes in British history. Two 10-year-old boys had taken a toddler from a busy shopping center, led him away in daylight, and killed him near a railway line. The trial, the sentences, the secrecy of their adult lives, and the later crimes of one of them meant the case never faded. Even after decades, the names Robert Thompson and John Venables could still cause anger. The name James Bulger, the little boy who was lost, was remembered by all. Before we close tonight's story, remember this is only one case among many. There are other crimes, other mysteries, and other lives forever changed. In the next story, we'll step into another account that carries its own darkness, its own secrets, and its own unanswered questions. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe now. And if you know someone who follows true crime as closely as you do, share this with them. It helps us keep bringing these long, detailed cases to you, story after story, chapter after chapter. Now, let's move on to the next case. Story 2. Paris, March 1944. The neighbors first noticed it as a strange smell carried on the evening air. Thick black smoke pushed out from the chimney of a grand townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur. It did not smell like wood. It was acrid, bitter, and foul, something no one in the neighborhood could quite place, but everyone knew it was wrong. For days the smoke continued. The house itself seemed deserted. Curtains stayed drawn, doors locked, and no one was seen coming or going. Yet the chimney worked endlessly, as if some unseen hand was feeding the flames below. Finally, the police were called. When 2 officers arrived, they knocked, but no one answered. They hesitated at the door, unsure whether to force their way in. Then the fire brigade was summoned. Axes broke glass, and boots crashed against the wood until the silence of the house gave way. Inside, dust lay thick on the furniture. The rooms seemed untouched for months, as if frozen in time. But when the officers descended the staircase to the basement, the stench grew unbearable. There, in the dim glow of the fire, they saw a stove glowing red. And sticking out of its open door was a human hand, charred but unmistakable. The sight froze them in place. Around the basement, scattered across the floor, were bones, skulls, rib cages, limbs. Some were stacked, others shoved into sacks, as if hidden in a hurry. Buckets of quicklime sat nearby, half filled with remains. The horror of it all was beyond anything they could have prepared for. The officers stumbled back, rushing to fetch reinforcements. But when they returned, minutes later, a man stood outside the house. He wore a gray coat and carried himself with calm assurance. He told them he was the brother of the doctor who owned the townhouse. He spoke softly, explaining that the bodies belonged to enemies of France, traitors, and German soldiers. He claimed it was all part of the resistance. The officers listened. They wanted to believe him. France was at war, and the resistance was sacred to many. The man assured them documents needed to be destroyed immediately, or the enemy would seize them. He asked for their silence, urging them not to report what they had seen. They agreed, and with that the man in the gray coat mounted his bicycle and rode away into the night. What they did not know was that this man was no resistance hero. He was no patriot. He was Marcel Petiot, a respected physician, former mayor, and family man, now revealed as one of the most horrifying killers France had ever known. And what lay hidden inside that townhouse was only the surface of a nightmare that stretched back decades. Long before the smoke from that Paris townhouse stained the sky, Marcel Petiot had already shown signs of something dark within him. He was born on January 17, 1897, in Auxerre, France. His parents worked long hours as postal employees. Their jobs demanded travel, and they were often absent from home. When they were gone, they left Marcel in the care of his Aunt Henriette. This constant shifting between parents who were rarely there and an aunt who struggled to control him left young Marcel unsettled. He was passed from one caretaker to another, and something in him began to twist. From an early age, anger showed itself in disturbing ways. While other children played harmless games, Marcel's attention turned toward living creatures smaller than himself. He tormented insects, stabbing them with his aunt's knitting needles. He trapped tiny birds, watching them struggle, and he smothered the family cat until it lay lifeless. These were not accidents. They were deliberate acts, carried out by a boy whose heart was already learning cruelty. Some would later say his behavior was the result of neglect. Others argued it was simply who he was from birth. Whatever the cause, the pattern was clear. Marcel had little regard for life. His Aunt Henriette, desperate to correct him, took him to church. She woke him early, forcing him to sit through Mass in hopes that religion might instill morals where none seemed to grow. But Marcel hated it. He resented the rituals, the sermons, the forced piety. Later in life, he would say these mornings only drove him away from faith entirely. At school, he was a contradiction. On one hand, he was gifted. By the age of 5, he could read fluently, far better than many children much older than him. Teachers noted his intelligence, but intelligence alone could not hide his disruptions. Marcel misbehaved constantly. He was restless, impulsive, and often violent. When he was 11, he stole his father's revolver. During a history lesson, he fired it into the classroom ceiling, shocking students and teacher alike. Not long after, during recess, he forced a classmate to stand against a door while he hurled knives around him, treating the boy like a target. These acts were not childish pranks. They were dangerous, calculated, and they revealed how little fear Marcel had of consequences. His troubles did not end there. In 1912, when he was 15, tragedy struck his family. His mother, only 36 years old, died of cancer. Her death shattered the home. For Marcel, it became fuel for more chaos. Instead of softening him, grief hardened him. His anger grew worse, his behavior more reckless. Soon after, his school expelled him. Violent outbursts, petty thefts, and defiance left administrators with no choice. He was pushed further to the margins, a boy with intelligence but no restraint. 2 years later, in 1914, his behavior crossed another line. At 17, he was caught stealing money from mailboxes. Instead of sending him to prison, the court ordered a psychiatric evaluation. Over the following months, Marcel sat with several doctors. Each tried to understand him. The consensus was vague. He suffered from some form of mental illness, though none could pin down its exact name. But his father refused to accept it. He insisted there was nothing wrong with Marcel, no hereditary curse, no hidden sickness in the family blood. To him, Marcel was simply choosing his path. Yet the pattern was there for anyone who looked closely. Cruelty, theft, violence, defiance, and now a growing file of medical suspicion. Still, Marcel would not stop. His story was only beginning, and each step led him further from the boy he had once been, and closer to the man the world would one day fear. In 1914, Marcel Petiot was only 17 when the law caught up with him again. This time, the police discovered him stealing money from mailboxes. It was a serious crime, but because of his age, the court showed him leniency. Instead of jail, they ordered doctors to examine him. For months, psychiatrists tried to assess what was wrong. They agreed he suffered from some form of mental illness, though none could give a precise name. Some saw signs of impulsive behavior, others of deep-rooted defiance. But no matter the diagnosis, the result was the same. Marcel was labeled unstable. His father refused to believe any of it. He insisted there were no mental health issues in their family, neither from his side nor from his late wife's. To him, Marcel was simply misbehaving by choice. By the time Marcel turned 18 in 1915, he had finished his education at a special academy in Paris after being expelled from other schools. Despite his history of theft and violence, he surprised his father by announcing that he wanted to become a doctor. His father dismissed the idea. He did not think Marcel had the discipline to follow such a demanding profession. But the world was about to shift. In 1916, France was deep in the horrors of World War I. Young men were needed on the front lines. At just 19, Marcel joined the army. Some say he was drafted into the infantry. Others believe he volunteered, hoping to serve as a medic. His time in battle was short. In May 1917, during a grenade explosion, Marcel injured his foot. He was taken to a hospital for recovery, but once there, his old troubles returned. His mental health seemed unstable, and soon he was transferred to a rest home for soldiers recovering from both physical and psychological trauma. From that moment, a pattern began. Marcel would return to his regiment, only to suffer another breakdown. He would then be sent back to hospital, declared unfit, and cycle through the same routine again. In June 1918, another injury appeared, this time a gunshot wound to his foot. Some suspected it was self-inflicted, a deliberate act to escape combat. Others believed it might have been genuine. Either way, Marcel was removed from the front lines. The war ended later that year, in November. By July 1919, Marcel was officially discharged from the army. He left with a disability pension, but doctors recommended he be admitted full-time to a psychiatric hospital. His service in the military had given him a taste of discipline and structure, but it had also exposed more of the same problems that had plagued him since childhood: impulsiveness, manipulation, and perhaps a growing ability to use illness as a shield against punishment. Now free from the army, Marcel looked toward the future. And despite all his troubles, he still wanted to become a doctor. After his discharge from the army in 1919, Marcel Petiot returned to civilian life with a disability pension. France, still reeling from the war, faced a shortage of doctors. To meet the urgent need, the government created an accelerated program for veterans who wanted to study medicine. Marcel seized the opportunity. Despite his history of instability and his time in hospitals, he was accepted into the program. He applied himself to his studies, and by December 1921, at the age of 25, he graduated. He was now officially licensed to practice medicine. With his new title, Marcel returned to Auxerre and opened a general practice in a small town nearby. The people welcomed him. He appeared charming, kind, and attentive. Patients liked that he took the time to ask about their lives, their families, and their struggles. To them, he seemed unusually compassionate, but behind the charm, his methods were questionable. Instead of carefully diagnosing illnesses, Marcel often gave patients narcotic drugs to ease their pain, whether or not they truly needed them. It made his patients feel better in the short term, but it did not treat their conditions. Still, many were satisfied and trusted him. Money was never an obstacle with Marcel. He rarely turned anyone away, even if they could not pay. But this generosity was not always genuine. He had enrolled most of his patients in a state-run medical assistance program that reimbursed doctors for treating those who couldn't afford care. Marcel took advantage of the system, charging the government even for patients who had already paid him. The people admired him, unaware of the quiet fraud behind his kindness. But there were other habits harder to ignore. Marcel was known to take small objects from the homes of patients during visits. A book here, a trinket there. It became something of an open secret in town that their doctor had a tendency to steal. Some called it odd, others amusing. Few took it seriously. They brushed it off as a strange quirk, not realizing it was a compulsion that would never leave him. For a time, his charm protected him. His patients admired his skill, his seeming compassion, and his unusual talent for guessing ailments quickly. It was as if he had a sixth sense for diagnosing the sick. In truth, he was more opportunist than miracle worker. By the mid-1920s, Marcel's life seemed stable. He had a respected career, loyal patients, and growing influence in the community. But this stability was fragile. Soon, a relationship would bring new suspicion to his name, and for the first time, whispers of something darker would surround him. By 1926, Marcel Petiot was 29 years old and well established in his small town. He had a steady practice, loyal patients, and the respect of many. But beneath the surface, his habits had not changed. He still stole small things. He still played with people's trust, and he still carried secrets. That year, Marcel met a young woman named Louise Delaveau. She was 26, a housekeeper who worked for one of his elderly patients. Their connection grew quickly. Before long, Louise moved into Marcel's home. To the outside world, this arrangement was questionable. Marcel was a respected doctor, and living with a woman unmarried was scandalous in that time. To avoid criticism, he told people she was simply his maid, but most in the town assumed they were lovers. Not long after, rumors began to spread that Louise was pregnant. Neighbors noticed her putting on weight, and whispers filled the streets. For Marcel, this was dangerous. Living with her had already stretched social expectations. Having a child out of wedlock threatened his reputation even more. Then suddenly Louise disappeared. It was May of 1926. She was gone without a word, without farewell, without a trace. Suspicion quickly turned toward Marcel. One witness claimed he had seen the doctor loading a large trunk into his car around the time of her disappearance. Days later, a trunk was found floating in a river outside town. Inside was the decapitated body of a young woman, but the corpse was too damaged by water to be identified with certainty. Without proof, police could not link it to Louise. Her case remained unsolved, labeled as a disappearance, not a murder. To the townspeople, the suspicion lingered, yet Marcel did not collapse under it. Instead, he played the part of a grieving lover. On the streets, he appeared distraught, his face heavy with sorrow. He cried openly, convincing many that he had been abandoned rather than guilty of something darker. But Marcel was not finished. That summer, only months after Louise's disappearance, he shocked the community with a bold move. He announced that he was running for mayor. During his campaign, he stood before the people and began a speech with a strange confession. "I confess that I am guilty of a serious crime," he declared. After a pause, he continued, "I stand accused of loving the people too much." The crowd listened, and against all expectation, his charm worked once more. On July 25, 1926, Marcel Petiot was elected mayor in a landslide victory. The disappearance of Louise faded into silence. The town had chosen to trust their doctor, even as shadows trailed him. After his election in July 1926, Marcel Petiot settled into his new role as mayor. The people had trusted him, and he used that trust to climb higher. The following year, in June 1927, Marcel married 23-year-old Georgette Lablanche, the daughter of a wealthy landowner. 10 months later, their only son Gerhard was born. To outsiders, Marcel now appeared as a man with everything: a family, a respected career, and political power. As mayor, he oversaw projects that improved the town. He supported the building of a new sewer system, pushed for upgrades to the elementary schools, and secured state funds for local needs. These visible achievements gave him praise and made him appear dedicated to the people. But beneath the surface, the same old habits continued. His kleptomania grew worse. Marcel stole constantly, taking things that were not his: money from desks, objects from offices, even a marching band's drum. Once he went so far as to steal a stone cross from the entrance of a cemetery. Most people dismissed these acts as eccentricities, quirks of an unusual man. They overlooked them, just as they had before. But in December 1928, Marcel pushed too far. He had ordered motor oil and collected it from the train station. Later, he claimed the order never arrived and tried to get reimbursed. It was a clear attempt at fraud. This time, the regional government took notice. The result was swift. Marcel was sentenced to 3 months in prison. Yet, just as he had done during his military days, he escaped real punishment by claiming he was in an agitated mental state. Instead of prison, he was only suspended from office for 1 month. In March 1930, he returned to his position as mayor, but scandal soon followed again, and this time, it ended with blood. On the evening of March 11, 1930, a fire broke out at the home of a local dairyman, Ormel Dubos. His wife, Henriette, was inside when it started. Ormel rushed back from a cafe and managed to drag her from the flames, but it was too late. She was dead. Her injuries, however, told a different story. Henriette had not been killed by the fire. She had been struck on the head with a blunt object. The fire had been set only to cover the crime. The townspeople whispered. Rumors spread that Henriette had been having an affair with Marcel. On the night of the murder, a cafe owner even claimed to have seen Marcel near the Dubos home. Weeks later, the cafe owner, Leon, died suddenly after receiving a mysterious injection from Marcel during a visit. Officially, the cause was listed as an aneurysm, but the doctor who signed the papers was Marcel himself. If true, this raised Marcel's suspected body count to 3: Louise, Henriette, and Leon. Yet none of these deaths were proven. Once again, he walked free, still trusted by many. By August 1931, new complaints of financial misconduct led to his suspension once more. This time, rather than fight, Marcel resigned. But his ambition did not end there. Later that same year, he was elected as a regional councillor, a position similar to a congressman. Even then, his deceit continued. In 1932, he was caught jury-rigging wiring to steal power for his home. He was fined, and the scandal forced him to leave politics altogether. In January 1933, Marcel moved to Paris with Georgette and their son. There, in the capital, he opened a new medical practice. He sought a fresh start, but his old ways followed him still. In January 1933, Marcel Petiot arrived in Paris with his wife Georgette and their young son. He settled into a new neighborhood and opened another medical practice. To the people who met him there, he seemed like a compassionate doctor. He listened closely, asked about his patients' lives, and showed the same warmth that had won him admiration in Auxerre. But as before, his kindness was a mask. Marcel was quick to prescribe drugs to anyone who asked, even to people struggling with addiction. He did not care if it helped their health. He cared only that it kept them coming back. His stealing also continued. He could not resist taking small objects wherever he went. In April 1936, he was caught trying to steal a book. When police intervened, Marcel attacked an officer. He was arrested, but once again he played the same role as before. He claimed he was mentally unstable, and instead of prison, he was sent briefly to a psychiatric hospital. The pattern was clear. Whenever he was threatened with punishment, he leaned on claims of illness. Each time it worked. By 1938, he was in trouble again, this time for evading taxes. But punishment was light, and he remained free. Then, in September 1939, the world changed. Germany invaded Poland, and France was pulled into the war. Within months, German forces swept across Europe. By June 1940, France surrendered. Paris fell under Nazi occupation. Many French citizens fled, fearing for their lives. But Marcel did not run. He stayed in the city, watching closely. Where others saw danger, he saw opportunity. In August 1941, he bought a grand townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur, one of the most fashionable addresses in Paris. The property needed heavy renovation, but Marcel paid easily. His instructions to the builders were unusual. One of the outbuildings was converted into a medical room. The walls were padded with thick material. Metal rings were fastened into another wall. A small glass peephole was installed into a third. Marcel told the builders he planned to open a private asylum, and that the room would be used for electroshock therapy. The padding, he said, would muffle the noise. The rings, he claimed, would hold equipment, and the peephole would allow him to observe. But these explanations were only stories. What Marcel truly planned for that townhouse was far more sinister. It began with a barber named Roland. In conversation one day, Roland told Marcel about a group of cyclists who had been caught trying to escape Nazi-occupied France. The remark was casual, but Marcel leaned in. He said that if Roland knew anyone who wished to flee the country, he could help. He claimed he had a network that could smuggle people to South America. The price, he explained, was 25,000 francs, less than half of what other escape routes demanded. Roland was convinced. He introduced Marcel to two couples desperate to leave. One morning in September 1942, they met Marcel at Roland's barber shop. From there, Marcel led them away. They were never seen again. Weeks later, Roland received a letter supposedly sent from Argentina. It said the couples had arrived safely. Marcel handed it to him as proof. Satisfied, Roland kept sending more people to Marcel. Jews, resistance fighters, and even criminals with prices on their heads, all desperate to escape Nazi terror, came to Marcel. They carried money, jewelry, and valuables to pay for their passage. Each time, Marcel led them into his townhouse. Each time, they vanished. In truth, there was no escape network. Once inside, Marcel injected his victims with what he claimed were vaccines to protect them from diseases they might face abroad. Instead, the syringe held cyanide. The victims collapsed within moments. Their bodies were stripped of possessions and their valuables taken. At last, Marcel's dark nature had found its stage. In the middle of occupied Paris, under the cover of war, he began to kill on a scale no one had imagined. For months, Marcel Petitot's scheme continued. People believed he was their way out of occupied France. They arrived with hope and valuables, and they never returned. Marcel collected everything they carried, from money to gold watches, but he did not stop at theft. Killing had become part of his method, yet his activities did not go unnoticed. By May 1943, the Germans themselves had grown suspicious. They believed Marcel was running a real escape network, smuggling people out of France. On May 21, 1943, they arrested him along with several associates. Marcel was imprisoned for 8 months. The Germans tortured him, demanding information. His teeth were filed, his body beaten, even an iron mask was clamped over his head to crush his skull. But Marcel gave them nothing. He had no names to reveal because his victims had not escaped anywhere. They were dead. In January 1944, finding no proof of an escape network, the Germans released him. They planned to keep watch on him, but they had not searched his townhouse. Inside, the building still held the remains of many victims. Until then, Marcel had often disposed of bodies by burying them or throwing them into rivers. But after his release, he knew the risk was too great. Too many eyes were on him. He needed another way. In the basement of 21 Rue Le Sueur, Marcel set up stoves and brought in sacks of quicklime. He worked through the nights, dissolving and burning bodies piece by piece. For weeks, smoke rose from the chimney, carrying a foul, oily stench. By March 1944, the smell had grown impossible to ignore. Neighbors whispered. Something unnatural was coming from that house. At last, they called the police. On the evening of March 11th, 2 officers arrived at the townhouse. They found the doors locked and the windows sealed. They called Marcel, who answered from his family home across the city. He told them he would come in 15 minutes and ordered them not to enter without him. The officers waited. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Marcel did not appear. At last, they called the fire brigade. Firemen smashed their way inside. Dust lay thick across most of the rooms. Furniture was untouched, as if no one had lived there for months. But when they reached the basement, the truth revealed itself. In the corner, a stove burned fiercely. Black smoke poured from its chimney. And through the open door of the stove, a human hand protruded, charred and curled. Around the basement, bones were scattered. Skulls, rib cages, torsos, and limbs lay in piles. Buckets of quicklime sat nearby, half filled with remains. A sack bulged with body parts. A blood-stained hatchet leaned against the wall. The horror was overwhelming. The officers ran out for help. Minutes later, when they returned, A man in a gray coat stood waiting outside. Calm and composed, he told them he was Marcel's brother. He explained that the bodies belonged to Germans and traitors to France. He said Marcel was part of the resistance and the killings were acts of war. He urged the officers to keep quiet, insisting there were important documents that needed to be destroyed before the enemy could find them. The officers hesitated. Believing his story, they let him go. The man in gray mounted his bicycle and disappeared into the night. It was not Marcel's brother. It was Marcel himself. He had slipped through their grasp, leaving behind the house of death that bore his name. On the night of March 11, 1944, after Marcel Petiot slipped away in his gray coat, the police were left with the nightmare inside 21 Rue Le Sueur. Human remains lay scattered in the basement, stuffed into sacks, buried in quicklime, and smoldering in the stoves. The officers called for reinforcements. By 10:30 that evening, a new figure arrived at the townhouse, Detective Georges Massou. He was an experienced investigator, highly decorated, with thousands of arrests behind him. Now he stood in the dim basement, staring at the evidence of a killer who had walked free only moments earlier. The Germans, too, learned of the discovery. At 1:30 in the morning, they sent a telegram demanding that Marcel Petiot be captured at once. Their unusual urgency made Massou suspicious. Normally, German forces did not interfere with domestic French cases. If they wanted Petiot so badly, perhaps they believed he was tied to the resistance. That night, Massou chose not to rush. He ended his inspection and planned to continue the search the next day. His delay gave Petiot more time. Early the next morning, police visited Marcel's family home. They learned they had missed him by only 30 minutes. He had already fled. Investigators widened their search. They traveled to Auxerre, Marcel's hometown, where his younger brother Maurice lived. Maurice worked at a radio station, and when questioned, he insisted he had not seen Marcel since February. He claimed he was shocked by the news of the townhouse. He did not even know his brother owned such a place. Massou was not convinced. He ordered officers to watch the Auxerre train station in case Marcel appeared. Instead of Marcel, his wife Georgette was spotted. She was taken in for questioning. Georgette told investigators she knew nothing of her husband's business. Marcel had always kept his affairs private, and she said she had never asked questions. She swore she had no idea what he had done at the townhouse. Maurice was questioned again. At first, he held to his story, but soon cracks appeared. A workman came forward, telling police he had helped Maurice deliver 880 pounds of quicklime to the townhouse only weeks earlier. When Massou confronted him with this, Maurice admitted the delivery had happened, but he claimed Marcel told him it was only for cleaning and exterminating roaches. It was not enough to clear him. On March 17, 1944, Maurice was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. That same day, investigators found another of Marcel's associates, a man named René Nebo. He had known Marcel for 20 years. At first, René denied everything, but after days of questioning, he broke. He confessed that Maurice had found between 50 and 60 bodies at the townhouse while Marcel was in German custody. Maurice had told René the truth, and René had kept silent. The circle of knowledge was widening. It became clear that Marcel's family and friends had seen evidence of his crimes, but had done nothing to stop him. Yet even with these revelations, the police were no closer to catching Marcel himself. He was still out there, hidden in the shadows of Paris, as investigators struggled to uncover the full extent of what he had done. After the discovery at Rue Le Sueur, the question was not only where Marcel Petiot had gone, but also who his victims were. The basement held bones, ashes, and fragments, but the remains were too damaged to identify. Detective Massou pushed forward. He gathered every possible clue, but the task was overwhelming. Without intact bodies, it was nearly impossible to count how many had been killed, let alone put names to them. Whispers spread quickly across Paris. Newspapers called Petiot Dr. Satan. Some claimed he had dissolved victims alive in quicklime, forcing them to suffer as they sank. The truth was already horrifying, but rumors made it darker still. Police turned their attention to Marcel's circle. They had already arrested his brother Maurice and his old friend René. They questioned Georgette again, certain she must have known something. She repeated her claim that her husband never shared his business with her. She stayed silent, or perhaps she truly never asked questions. René admitted more under pressure. He told investigators that while Marcel was being tortured by the Germans, Maurice had discovered bodies in the townhouse. He said Maurice confided in him about what he had seen, between 50 and 60 corpses hidden inside. Still, none of them had gone to the police. They had kept the secret, leaving Marcel free to continue. The search for Marcel himself dragged on. He had vanished from sight, and with the war still raging, attention was divided. By June 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy. Resistance fighters rose in numbers across France. In the chaos, Petiot slipped further into hiding. But he did not remain idle. Under a false name, Henri Valéry, he joined a resistance group called the French Forces of the Interior. In August 1944, as Paris rose up and German troops were driven from the city, Marcel fought among them, his new identity keeping him safe. The irony was sharp. Months earlier, he had tricked officers by claiming to be part of the resistance. Now, he truly was. Hidden under a borrowed name, he moved among patriots who had no idea who stood at their side. For the moment, his disguise worked, but arrogance would soon betray him. By late 1944, Marcel Petiot was living under his false name, Henri Valéry. As a captain in the French Forces of the Interior, he blended into the resistance. He carried himself as a patriot, and few suspected the truth. But Detective Massou had not forgotten him. The manhunt continued, and Massou searched for new leads. In September 1944, he reached out to a French newspaper called Présent. He wanted them to print the account of a man named Charles Rouleau, who claimed to have known Marcel. The story was explosive. It described Marcel's past involvement in drugs and prostitution. Some details may have been exaggerated, but Massou's goal was clear. He wanted to provoke a reaction. If Marcel saw his name in print, perhaps he would reveal himself. The plan worked. Not long after the article appeared, Marcel sent a letter to the paper. In it, he denied the accusations, but he also admitted that he was living under another name and fighting for the resistance. That was enough for Massou. He now knew Marcel had joined the French Forces of the Interior. He sent word to be on the lookout for an officer matching Marcel's description. On October 31st, 1944, the search ended. At a train station in Paris, Marcel Petiot was spotted. Officers closed in. They overpowered him, dragged him into custody, and at last, after 7 months on the run, he was caught. The trial was set, but it took time to prepare. Investigators charged him with 27 murders, the victims they could identify. His brother Maurice, dying of stomach cancer, saw his charges dropped. Marcel would stand alone. Through it all, Marcel kept to his story. He insisted he was a resistance fighter. He claimed every person he had killed was a traitor or a German collaborator. He refused to admit guilt for the true crimes in the basement of Rue Le Sueur. But the resistance did not support him. Not one member came forward to defend his claim. He was on his own, and the evidence was against him. The trial opened on March 18, 1946. The courtroom was tense. Witnesses described the discovery of bones and ashes, the neighbors' accounts of the black smoke, and the testimony of those who had referred people to Marcel's so-called escape network. Piece by piece, the picture was laid out. Marcel listened calmly, showing little emotion. On April 4th, the jury returned with their decision. After only 3 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. But his story did not end there. When Marcel Petiot was sentenced to death on April 4th, 1946, he showed no sign of fear. He seemed resigned, almost calm, as if the verdict had not shaken him. To the court, to the press, and even to those guarding him, it was strange to see a man accused of such horrors accept his fate so quietly. The weeks before his execution passed without drama. Marcel spent time with his wife, Georgette, and agreed to meet with a priest, but only to satisfy her. He told the priest plainly, "I am not a religious man, and my conscience is clean." He still claimed he had done nothing wrong. He insisted that he had killed only enemies of France. To the end, he refused to admit the truth of what investigators had uncovered in the basement of Rue Le Sueur. On May 25th, 1946, the sentence was carried out. In the early hours of the morning, Marcel was led to the guillotine. Guards bound his hands. The back of his neck was shaved. His collar was removed. He waited without resistance, his face steady. At 5:05 a.m., the blade fell. In a single instant, Marcel Petiot, once a doctor, once a mayor, once a man trusted by many, was dead. Some witnesses swore that as the blade dropped, he wore a faint smile. His reign of terror was over. And that brings us to the end of this chilling case. If you've stayed with me through every chapter, you now know the full story of Marcel Petiot, the man who wore the mask of a doctor but lived as one of France's most feared killers. For more long, true crime stories told in the same style, make sure you subscribe to the channel and don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss the next episode. Thank you for listening. And until next time, good night.